ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start thanking to The Economist for organizing this very important event, which is very relevant for the Romanian government endeavor to find solutions and to support all the efforts done in regard to help our economy and also to give our hand to what really means the international support for Ukrainian government and for the Ukrainian people. So thank you very much again for organizing and choosing us to have this very important event organized in Bucharest. Odată cu
So, I just wanted to start by addressing my gratitude to The Economist for organizing this event in Bucharest. I would also like to welcome the initiative of the partners who joined this event, the American Chamber of Commerce and the Dutch Chamber of Commerce in Romania. They have very much contributed to organizing this debate in Bucharest, a debate which very much concerns Europe, the political stakeholders and the governments in all countries. The questions and our concerns, our joint concerns, all refer to the effects which the major crisis which was created by the Russian invasion and the geopolitical context will have long-term, short-term and middle-term in terms of security, but also in economic and social perspective. Some time ago, I returned from the meeting of the NATO member states in Sofia, hosted by the Premier Minister Kirill Petkov. I had the opportunity to have some bilateral meetings with the Prime Minister of North Macedonia and the Prime Minister of Montenegro. This meeting was a very good opportunity for us to speak about our coordination, to coordinate our joint efforts so as to be able to manage the challenges brought about by the Russian invasion. The alliance we are part of is the strongest guarantee we have to protect our citizens. The NATO summit in Brussels, the decision of the allies to consolidate the eastern flank, the message conveyed by the USA, they all converge, they all go into the same direction. Together we defend democracy, our citizens and economies. Together we will be able to manage this very difficult historic challenge. Romania enjoys all security safeguards and the whole solidarity of NATO. The most powerful political and military alliance is now present in Romania and acts jointly to consolidate the eastern flank. The power of the partnership between Romania and the US is proven in this very difficult context. Alongside the other European countries, we militate and convey our solidarity to the Ukrainian people. Our message is for peace, democracy and prosperity for our citizens. The new geopolitical context brings the need for fast adjustments and adjustments to the new and old challenges of the European project. Resilience, and in terms of in economical terms, cohesion, social cohesion, coordination of governmental action, all these are the milestones of all our efforts. This is the message I would like to convey to investors in Bucharest, those investors who want to come to Bucharest and extend their business. Romania acts based on a very well articulated plan of measures which was elaborated shortly after the invasion. It has been adapted permanently to European and international developments. The objective is to protect our citizens and economy. The economic model is based on strengthening resilience via policies for sustainable and inclusive economic growth, supporting investments, taking over good practices emerging from previous crises like the pandemic or the energy crisis. We are very much involved in discussions concerning the revision of the Stability and Growth Pact, which are decisive for taking good advantage of this model. The plan adopted by the European Commission and Romania asked the Commission to do so. This plan will support the EU countries and will enhance their flexibility in terms of state aid. In a meeting which I'm going to have tomorrow, I will speak with Mr. Paolo Gentiloni, the European Commissioner in charge for European economy. We will speak about this European framework for economic support. I have read the messages following the meetings which the commissioner had with Romania's president and the finance minister, who is present here in this room. And I'm very happy to see that at the level of the European Union, there is a forecast of economic growth of 4%. And there is real concern that for the invasion and its effects to impact the least possible on our economy. Your presence here encourages us to believe, to be optimistic, and to believe that there is an interest for opportunities in the Romanian economy, and I want to assure you that Romania is a place where investments are safe, a place where investments can bring benefits both for investors and for the Romanian citizens. 15 years after Romania joining the EU, our objective is to reduce differences in terms of development as compared to other EU countries and also within Romania. The very important steps we have made, translate in threefold increasing the budget, liberty of movement. The domestic market is open to investors who benefit of state aid and also European aid. Given the pandemic, we have elaborated the plan of resilience, and this will make possible to support reforms which we all need. Given the security crisis, the energy crisis, the health crisis, our government still wants to protect citizens, to offer financing from the state budget and also from European money. We have come up with solutions to ensure stability until the 1st of April 2023. So there is a one-year perspective for what means the impact of the price for energy and gas having increased. This year, we have allocated the highest budget for investment in the last 30 years, that is 88 billion lei. From the National Plan for Resilience, based on which Romania will get 30 billion euros in the years to come, the first projects are already ongoing. Romania will have 80 billion euros in total for projects of investments and development. This is a unique opportunity to recover major differences in strategic fields. Digitization, energy, health, healthcare, education, infrastructure, environment. In all these fields, we have the perspective of a sustainable development which will impact the modernization of the country and increasing the quality of life. It is a huge, unprecedented volume of investments for the next 5 years. The private environment, business environment, and the administrative capacity of our authorities can guarantee the success of investments. There will be reforms, fiscal reform, reform of state companies, reforms in the field education, healthcare, and pension systems, energy in the energy sector, renewable energies, speeding up the process of digitization of economy and Romanian society as a whole is a milestone in the plan of resilience, but also a fundamental step for the implementation of the new model for the development of Romania and ensuring convergence with advanced European countries. Creation of the framework which is necessary for transition to digital society. All these contribute to the government's objective to implement a new paradigm which is grounded on economic and social basis. The energy sector, re-technologizing, modernization of energy networks, and investments in the storage facilities, energy storage facilities, are also an important opportunity. Aligning to the Green Deal objectives and the European Industrial Strategy offer a whole range of priorities for revitalizing the industry in Romania. Against this background, the development of value and also the transition to a circular economy are essential objectives which contribute to fulfilling the objectives on the single market. The major challenges concerning reduction of effects of climate change need a set of appropriate solutions. Given the Fit for 55 package, the economic priorities go into creation of the infrastructure needed for creation of green energy, attracting strategic investments and creation of industrial innovative ecosystems. These directions are included in the government's vision to modernize the Romanian industry by integration of digitization, technological and social innovation, eco-innovation, and circular economy. The economic stability and the support of the business environment, social cohesion, strengthening the relationship to international organizations which think in democratic terms, all this belongs to the vision of the Romanian government. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to convey a message of trust to the business environment. Romania is a safe country attached to the democratic values, and it is involved in a process of strengthening and developing its economy. Our economic model based on resilience, cohesion, and solidarity, as well as our determination to be in the first line of the transformation connected to the new European project. All this makes Romania an interesting destination for business. Before closing my address and thanking again to the organizers, I would like to say that everything which represents the target of our government, our first priority is to create a safe business environment, to identify solutions for what means to put citizens in the middle of our interest and concern. We very much want to act so as to be able to preserve jobs and to ensure sustainable development. Given that I have just come from the meeting I've had with the other three prime ministers, I would like to just mention that we have talked about everything connected to the impact of the war on the evolution of developments in terms of security and economy. And I ensured them that the Romanian government is already looking for solutions so as to be able to support any initiative, any opportunity for relocation of business from countries affected by the war. And in this respect, I would like to ask you to explore all the possibilities which the Romanian government offers in this respect. So again, thank you. I would like to thank to the organizers for having invited me here, having given me the possibility to speak before the investments. So thank you, The Economist. I would like to also thank to the American and Dutch Chamber of Commerce, and also I would like to express my gratitude to all Romanian investors. I wish you a lot of success.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Prime Minister, for setting out the contours of your government's economic policies, policies for the business environment and reform. This is a business and investment summit, so it's very important that we hear that at the highest level. And tomorrow, of course, we're going to be discussing all these things in much more detail. We'll be looking at the impact of the war on growth and inflation, and looking at the policy response both from the EU, at the EU level, and from the Romanian government and its various ministries. So thank you very much once again for sharing that perspective with us. For the rest of the evening, we are going to focus on geopolitics and the impact of the war in Ukraine, and we're now going to be joined by Wes Mitchell, a former US Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs, who's joining us from Washington by connection. And I would like to ask John Bruton, a former Prime Minister of Ireland, to join me on the stage. And after we hear from Wes in a few moments, we'll have time for a short conversation and we'll have some questions. So it'd be good to hear your comments. Please come and join me on the stage. And welcome. Have a seat. Hello, Wes. Are you hearing us okay?
I hear you loud and clear, Joan. You hear me?
We do. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us. And I can't wait to hear what you've got to say about everything that's been happening, and probably more importantly, where this is heading.
Yes.
So I'm handing right over to you.
Good. Well, thank you for that, Joan. It's a delight to see you again. And I'm grateful to The Economist for the opportunity to speak today. It's especially a privilege to be able to hear the remarks just now from Prime Minister Ciucă. And let me extend my greetings to him and other Romanian friends in the audience today. Romania is a place that's very dear to my heart. I've spent a lot of time in Romania over the years and have a lot of colleagues and acquaintances there. And I know there's a lot of anxiety in Romania and neighboring frontline NATO states because of what's happening next door following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think we've all been shocked, frankly, by the savagery that Putin has displayed in this conflict. We all see the pictures coming out of Ukraine, and on a human level, I think we have to start by acknowledging the tragedy of what's occurring there. We see the devastated cities, the children that are being pulled out of the rubble, and all of this has been a sobering reminder that, well, the old-fashioned word for it is evil, that evil is alive and well in the 21st century. Here in the United States, the war, as you probably know, has galvanized our public attention. It's reshuffling our politics. But, of course, we don't feel the effects of the conflict the way that you do there in Romania. The members of your audience who are sitting next to the conflict right there at the frontier, you there in the region see the refugees arriving, you feel the impact on regional trade, and you almost certainly feel more intensely than anyone the danger that the war could escalate or spread. The organizers asked me to say a few words about what businesses and governments there in the Black Sea region can expect over the next few months, how long the war is likely to last, whether it'll end anytime soon, and what the aftermath will be for regional economies, energy security, the European Union, NATO, et cetera. So let me address each of those questions in turn. First of all, I think at this point, we have to plan on the expectation that this will not be a short conflict. I think we have to assume that it will last several more months, possibly through the end of the year, and that even if a political resolution is reached, that the conditions will now exist for a simmering, maybe intermittent conflict in the years ahead. I think Putin wanted a short, decisive war in which he would quickly change the government in Ukraine to a pro-Kremlin direction. Obviously, he got a very different outcome. I think the sacrifice and the resilience of the Ukrainian army and Ukrainian people is one of the great events of our time. The longer the war goes on, I think the greater the chance that Putin will be deposed, either by his own people or by the Praetorians in the Kremlin. The Russian army has, of course, lost thousands of soldiers and a lot of equipment, probably the flower of its elite units, probably a good portion of its most advanced munitions. So it's certainly possible that those losses will force Putin to accept a negotiated settlement. But I don't think that is going to happen soon for a couple of reasons. One, I think both Russia and Ukraine possess ample resources to continue the conflict. The Russians have suffered a lot of losses, but still have a material advantage and probably a bottomless supply of artillery shells, for example, to keep pounding Ukrainian cities. The Ukrainians have a very large and motivated force in the field at this point that is well supplied with Western weapons. But I also think that both Putin and Zelensky, for very different reasons, have a lot of motivation to keep fighting. Putin's motivation is the continued existence of his regime and his own life. I think Zelensky's motivation is to defend and reclaim the Ukrainian homeland. If Putin were to accept a negotiated settlement without a very large amount of territory, it could cost him his regime. And I think if Zelensky were to concede territory at this stage, it would probably cost him the support of the Ukrainian people. So even if there were the terms for a settlement coming into view tomorrow, it would probably only be a pause that Russia would use to rearm and continue the conflict at a later date. Even in the worst case, that Putin uses chemical weapons or, God forbid, nuclear weapons, it's very unlikely at this point that he would break the will of the Ukrainian people to resist. And I think the war is creating generational enmities that will be with us for a very long time. So for all of those reasons, I expect the war in its current or a similar form to be protracted. My second assumption is that as the war continues, the center of gravity will shift more and more to the south of Ukraine, to the Black Sea coast. I think Putin has largely relinquished his initial objectives and is focusing more and more on the coastline, the east and south of the country, for both economic and strategic reasons. I think if he can control all or most of the Ukrainian coastline, he can deprive Ukraine of a viable economy after the war. Ukrainian ports will probably remain offline for many months, maybe longer. Even if the Ukrainians hold Odessa, which it looks like they will, it will probably be unusable as a port for a very long time because the Russians control the approaches to that port, both from Snake Island at the mouth of the Danube and Sebastopol. So I would expect to see Ukrainian wheat and other exports remain disrupted. Russia will probably continue its policy of hoarding its own grain supply well into the summer. And of course, Russian energy exports are now highly constricted. The last figures that I saw, Russian crude by vessel had dropped from about 2 million barrels a day to around zero or next to zero. And of course, the economic effects of all of this are very well known to the people in the room there. I expect we will see sustained inflationary pressures, shortages, supply chain disruptions, all of that well into the future. I think factories in the region will continue to face challenges with parts that are sourced from Ukraine or Russia for obvious reasons. Probably more and more of a ripple effect on German and other Western manufacturing in the region. And then, of course, in certain cases, and I'm thinking of Turkey in particular, there's a high degree of vulnerability, and we could even see a currency crisis for the lira. Romania is a resilient country with strong institutions and a well-established ecosystem of private industry, and I have no doubt that it will continue to thrive for all the reasons outlined by the Prime Minister. But I think we have to be honest about the challenges that lie ahead. The other thing I would say is that none of this is localizable. The longer the war goes on, the more likely we are to see stagflation at the global level. So far, we've seen a very high degree of solidarity between the United States and European Union on sanctions, and in Europe's case, a willingness to increase defense spending. And I hear it frequently asked whether this impulse of solidarity will prove durable. High gas prices always boomerang in politics, and it's also possible that European publics could grow somewhat reticent about defense spending when they see reductions in social spending. But I actually think that the new solidarity will be durable because it's rooted in a very powerful motivator, which is fear. I think there's a palpable fear that Putin will keep going. If you look at polling data in Germany, something like 30% of Germans a year ago would have said that they thought NATO was necessary for their country's security. Now that number is closer to 75 or 80%, which is remarkable. I don't see that dissipating quickly. I also think the war is setting in motion changes that will have a momentum all of their own. You have several Western oil companies that have pulled out of Russia. That's not something that will quickly be undone, and it will inevitably affect long-term Russian output. The German government is developing plans for LNG terminals. You'll see long-term contracts developing on the basis of European countries willing to pay a premium to mitigate supply vulnerabilities. And my point is that all of that, once it's set in motion, is likely to have a momentum and a kind of continuity to it. In the case of the United States, I also think the war's effects will not be transitory. I think we will see the administration and Congress, well, today we see a very high level of consensus in US policy. I think we'll keep up the pressure on sanctions, we'll keep sending military aid to Ukraine, and I think we'll see a new consensus form. I think it's forming now, and in the next few weeks, you'll see it more, of a willingness to build permanent US military bases in Eastern Europe, perhaps including the permanent relocation of the Stryker Brigade that was recently deployed on a temporary basis from Germany to Romania. Where you do see a debate in the United States is over whether we should get directly involved in the conflict in some way. There's a push in some circles to impose a no-fly zone. For reasons I'm happy to elaborate on, I don't think that will gain momentum. There's also a push to say that our objective is regime change in Russia, which President Biden seemed to allude to last week, but I don't see any indication that that is or will be official policy. I think the bigger question for the United States is how much resources we should siphon towards Europe, knowing that China could very well use this moment to make a move on Taiwan. And of course, the United States military is currently not configured to handle major war with Russia and China simultaneously. But what I think Putin has done is given us an unexpected opportunity in the West to focus first and foremost on the challenge of Russia. I think Putin probably moved on Ukraine on a faster timeline than Xi would probably like to move on Taiwan. And so the longer Putin is bogged down in Ukraine, the more I think he will face a situation like the Soviets faced in Afghanistan, where his military is being bled white and his economy is being wrecked at home. Finally, if I had to say where all of this ends, I think it's probably a military stalemate that eventually allows for a negotiated settlement in which Ukraine takes on a special status. It may be what you could call fortified neutrality. So something on the model of Finland today, where perhaps Ukraine decides to relinquish the objective of NATO membership, but eventual EU membership may stay in the equation. But the only way that this will work is for the West to have a long-term strategic and economic commitment to Ukraine, to arm the Ukrainians to the teeth, to help rebuild their economy, maybe by using seized Russian assets or foreign exchange reserves as a form of reparations. I think that's where we will eventually end in some form or fashion. Unfortunately, I think it'll probably cost a lot more lives before we reach that point, just given the situation on the battlefield. But to end on a positive note, I think if there is a silver lining to the war, the awful situation in Ukraine, I think it is that Putin has managed in the course of a few weeks to bring about a remarkable degree of unity and resolve in the Western world, a greater degree of unity than we've seen in generations. And I think the war has reminded us what we're fighting for, what we have in common, what's worth preserving. Putin is clearly overplaying his hand, and the sacrifices of the Ukrainians, I think, are giving the West an opportunity to get our own affairs in order, and it's up to us to make the most of that opportunity. So I'll stop on that relatively positive note, and I want to say again how grateful I am to have the opportunity to join the discussion, and I look forward to hearing any questions.
Great, thanks very much, Wes. Before I hand over to John Bruton to give his thoughts about some of what you've just said, I'm going to ask a few questions which you can maybe think about while John's speaking, and because so many questions occurred to me as you were speaking. I think you gave a very clear outline, which I share, that this war is not going to be over anytime soon. Modern wars tend to drag on much longer than the people who started them imagined they ever will. There's always miscalculations, fatal mistakes, that come back to bite leaders who lead their nations into wars. But the questions that occurred to me are, will Russian energy supply to Europe be cut off, either because the Europeans decide to do so, or because Russia decides to do so as early as next week, perhaps? That's one. You talked about a long-term commitment now on the part of the US to Europe, which just 12 months ago, the opposite looked the case. So what does that mean for the tilt to Asia? And you said the US is not equipped to fight a war on two fronts against Russia and China, but surely China is the kind of biggest strategic threat to the US. And if the US is really devoting such resources, military and diplomatic, to Europe once again, what does that mean for China? Does it have more of a free hand in Asia? And I guess the other question is that how do you see China actually reacting? Should we assume that China is not actually going to abandon Russia, having just a few weeks before the war started, committed to an alliance with no limits, greater than any political or military alliance that existed during the Cold War? So those are just a few questions. And the final one is that how did we get here, Wes? I think that it's important to talk about where we are now and where it's going. But it's also important to try and understand how it ended up like this. Why did Russia do this now, is one question. Many people, I think pretty much everybody, has condemned the invasion and agrees that it's indefensible and abomination. But we've heard some arguing, including in the international relations field, that the West bears some responsibility for this, that it represents a failure of Western diplomacy and foreign policy over many, many years because of NATO expansion, the sighting of weapons systems, and so on. And that's created Russian insecurity, existential angst, and so on. What do you say to those sorts of arguments? So now I'm going to turn to John to give his views.
Congratulations, Joan. You anticipated almost everything I was going to say. Oh. I'd like to probe a little further with you about China. Clearly, China has been investing a lot of money and lending a lot of money to promote the Belt and Road Initiative, to give it a land-based access to the West, not relying on sea lanes, which might have been interdicted, capable of being interdicted by the United States. Now, the war is cutting right across the Belt and Road. It's inimical in that sense. This war is inimical, it would seem to me, to China's interests in developing the Belt and Road. Do you see any possibility that China could play a mediating role in bringing Russia to its senses in this matter? Or is the declaration that was made in Beijing of the character that Joan described something irrevocable and permanent, a permanent alliance between the two? The other observation I'd make is that while this has been a truly frightening event, it has, through that, led to unprecedented unity in the European Union. The idea that we would commit to significant investment in defence, significant sanctions, significant moving away from existing energy supply systems, and to do that all in the space of a few weeks in an organisation which has to act, the European Union has to act by unanimity among 27 countries. It's quite an achievement for Putin to have united the European Union in the way that he has done. It doesn't solve the problem, but it is a good step towards for the future security of Europe.
Thanks, John. So, Wes, I'm going to let you come back on some of those questions, maybe not all of them.
Sure. Well, I think those are all very good questions and comments, Joan, from you and Mr. Bruton. Just to take them quickly in the order that I heard them. On the question of Russian energy supplies to Europe, I tend to think that we will not see an interruption either from the European side or the Russian side. The German leaders in recent days have been very clear in their messaging that they would not, for example, support an end to the carve-out in Western sanctions packages. And the reason is obvious, the pressures, which I think the economic pressures which would lead to recession in Europe, given the current price of gas, just to take the most noticeable impact and what this would mean in politics in Europe. I do think, though, that there is a rising public desire to see Russian energy constrained in the West, and that will inevitably produce a political move at some point, and we see Western European countries moving quickly to fill up their excess storage capacity. I assume that they are doing that to prepare possibly for a Russian cutoff. At present, such relief as the Russians have from the effects of sanctions comes from the continuation of energy revenue. For all of those reasons, I would be surprised, despite the rhetoric, if we see either Russia or Europe move in that direction soon.
So how,
on the question of the United States,
Wes, how will the Europeans get around this issue now of payments in rubles? Because it's
very unclear to me. It's very unclear to me, and I think we have to read that as a kind of Russian stipulation that is as much about sending the message to Europeans of their dependency as it is a face value demand. But it's beyond me how Europeans can respond to that. I'm skeptical that they would. It's not even clear to me exactly how they would do so under current circumstances. But I read it more as an attempt by the Russians to remind Europeans of the dependency. I'm just skeptical that they will actually utilize the pressure, the leverage that they have at their disposal.
Thanks, Wes. Sorry.
On the question of...
Carry on.
Yeah, on the question of China, the long-term commitment to Europe, I think in a way what Putin has done is he is relieve a good part of the strategic dilemma that was facing the United States. I don't want to overstate it, and it's still very early. We don't know how the Chinese will react in due course. But if you look at Chinese, published Chinese defense modernization plans, for example, it's clear that the Chinese themselves believe they need another 3 or 4 years of a fairly vigorous modernization before they believe that they will have a decisive edge in a military clash over Taiwan. And so it suggests to me that Putin moved on a faster timeline for attempting to take Ukraine than the Chinese were prepared, well, not only for military reasons, but I think politically, Xi has been consumed with the party Congress this year. They've been dealing with coal shortage, a variety of reasons. I don't read the Chinese as seeing this as an auspicious moment to move on Taiwan. So in a sense, if that read is correct, by overplaying his hand or moving too early, Putin has provided a means for the United States to sequence these two theaters. And what that means in practice, I think, is we will see more in the direction of what we've seen in recent days of the United States looking at those aspects of our defense posture or defense equipment that could be placed in Eastern Europe, perhaps including permanent bases, that would increase the defense, the deterrence posture. For example, there are a lot of weapons that the United States and NATO need in a land war environment like Europe that we do not need in Asia Pacific. And so the conflict in Ukraine may act as an accelerant to the United States providing that kind of equipment, particularly to frontline NATO states, that's not in high demand in the Asia Pacific. Where I think the United States will continue to stop is at the point of material deployments in Europe that would cut into our global offensive strike capability for dealing with China should China move against Taiwan. But by galvanizing European defense spending, what Putin has basically done is alleviate the two-front problem for the United States. It'll take a few years for German defense spending, for example, the effects of that to be felt. But once it is felt, this will dramatically alleviate the pressure that the United States was feeling to single-handedly or mostly single-handedly secure both of these theaters simultaneously. But in the meantime, I expect to see a bifurcation of U.S. naval and air mainly focused on Asia and U.S. land power primarily focused on Europe. You asked a question about China, which was very similar to Mr. Bruton's comment or question. Look, I think Xi has a Putin problem at this point. If the war had gone quickly and Putin, his effort to grab Ukraine had been validated and he had installed a new government after maybe a couple of weeks of fighting, it might be different. But the longer the war goes on, two things happen that I think are a problem for Xi Jinping. The first is that Russia's strategic and economic dependency on China intensifies. You can imagine a situation in the next couple of years where, as a result of the innervation, the depletion, economic depletion brought by sanctions, the Russian economy is devastated and largely looking to China both for capital, which it already increasingly was doing, but also for workaround mechanisms to the effects of sanctions. The second reason this is a problem for Xi Jinping is I think Putin has attained a kind of global pariah status that is problematic for Xi Jinping insofar as I think the Chinese leadership still held out the prospect of positioning itself to the outside world and especially to U.S. allies as a credible stakeholder, as a constructive player in international institutions. It's very hard to maintain that image when you just a few weeks ago called the world's preeminent thug your closest friend and partner. So I think these are problems for Xi Jinping, and I think the longer the war goes on, the more of a problem both of them become. How did we get here, and to what extent is the war the outworking of Western mistakes? Well, I for one have no problem identifying Western strategic and policy failings of recent years. If you'll permit me, the most immediate that comes to mind was the Obama administration's reset with Russia, which came at the expense of U.S. military deployments in Central and Eastern Europe. But I think we have to be crystal clear that in moral terms and practical terms, the responsibility rests solely with Vladimir Putin. I am skeptical of this argument that I hear in some Western circles, a kind of hand-wringing, which says, because we expanded NATO, we put the Russians into a box and they had no choice but to lash out. I'm skeptical of this for strategic and historical reasons. I think if NATO had not extended into Central and Eastern Europe after the Cold War, then after an interlude of recovery, Russian expansion would have taken place not on the Dnieper, but on the Vistula. And we would, at present, have a kind of gray zone in the Visegrad countries where we were asking the same questions and we faced the same dilemmas, but it was on a line of longitude that is would be much closer to Western Europe proper. So I think it's the nature of Russia as a geopolitical actor, and particularly when it's led by despots of an authoritarian government, to have a militarily expansionist mentality. I don't think NATO enlargement into Central Europe and the Baltic states triggered that. I think the best we can do now is help the Ukrainians fight for their own independence. But I don't think this will land in a way where the Ukrainians will wish to enter NATO, or where Ukrainian membership in NATO will be politically viable within the alliance.
Thanks, Wes. That's very clear answers to all those questions. I have many more, but I'm afraid we're keeping these people from their dinner. So we're going to have to end it here. But thanks so much for joining us and giving us your very informed and erudite perspective on what's happening. Thanks very much indeed, and hope to see you again sometime soon. Thank you very much.
Joan, thank you for your hospitality, and Mr. Bruton, and thank your audience. It's been a delight to see you. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, thank you, John, as well. It was great having you up here. So everybody, please, dinner will be served now, and enjoy your evening, and carry on the discussion informally. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.